Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak on behalf of the Greens on the State Revenue Legislation Amendment Surcharge Bill 2017. And before I turn to where I was going to raise the concerns about the Greens, I must notice that the former member for Mile Lakes just put on the record that this government was keen to introduce measures into this place that would assist with housing affordability. And it is probably relevant to note that it was actually reported by the ABC back in March 2017 when the first debate happened around the stamp duty surcharge for foreign investors, that the Premier herself acknowledged that the stamp duty surcharge for foreign investors was in fact designed to raise revenue for the government and not make housing more affordable for first home buyers. It seems that since that time opinions have changed, and some good headlines to attempt to whip up a little bit of anti-foreigner sentiment about introducing what would be some measures put on foreign investors. Heaven forbid we talk about measures on investors in general when really we need to look at the housing affordability crisis as a whole. But an attempt to draw some headlines around foreign investment has turned, putting a surcharge on foreign investment has turned into a scenario where we are seeing a slow pedalling back of some of those measures to meet what was the Property Council's call reported in the Domain in May 2017, where we see the Property Council urges the New South Wales Government to remove hurdles for overseas investors as part of their housing affordability plan. So what we have currently in New South Wales is a situation where we have a housing affordability crisis, whether you're looking at the 60,000 individual applications, which probably represents in the order of 100,000 individual people that are currently approved for public housing in this state but are unable to access public housing because there is just simply not enough stock, and the stock that is there is not being maintained properly. To the other end of the spectrum, where we see people living in rental accommodation at a higher and higher level, unable to own their own home, and I note that in many of the minister and shadow ministers' electorates in this place, in the latest census figures we have seen that actually renters outnumber people with mortgages in those electorates, because what we see in those electorates is that those young people, those people of the younger generations, are now no longer in a position to even put themselves under the extreme housing stress that so many first homeowners find themselves in, and are not able to take up a mortgage and are finding themselves subjected to the private rental market, which is putting them into a life of insecurity and seeing them having to move house every 6 to 12 months. So we have at one end the public housing crisis that is going on, and let's be clear, this is not a public housing crisis because the tenants are in crisis. The tenants are wonderful people that are actually doing the best in worse conditions. What we are seeing is an underinvestment in public housing, an underinvestment in the maintenance of public housing, a failure to provide affordable housing stock across the public housing and community housing sector to the need that is actually urgent in crisis in this state. And at the other end of the spectrum, we are seeing people in the private rental market put into massive insecurity. So here we are. It's acknowledged it's a state revenue legislation bill. What are we doing? What are we doing here? We're not addressing this housing crisis that is before us. We're not doing anything to assist people in that, but instead what we are seeing is exemptions being provided to big property developers. So let's just take a second. So we've got thousands of people, tens of thousands of people that are currently, waiting for public housing. We have claims that we can't see this government find the money to invest in more public housing. And so what are we doing here? What are we doing here? We're providing exemptions for big property developers, for big corporations, and we're making sure that they are provided with exemptions and basically gifts, as we heard the member earlier speaking, when the member for Cessnock was outlining his concerns with this bill, writing a blank cheque to those property developers, because no one can answer the question how much this is going to cost or how much this will cost in real terms for money that is not going into the public purse. At the time when these changes were first introduced, or were first announced, I should say, we called on the Premier and the government to actually make this foreign investor tax, make this surcharge an actual housing affordability measure. And there's one simple way to do that. One simple way to actually make this not just a revenue raising exercise would be to take the money raised, from this surcharge and put it into housing affordability measures. We know that there is a need for a massive investment in public housing in the state and community housing and affordable housing, and that would be one way to turn what is a revenue raiser into an affordable housing measure. We know that it basically looks like here what has happened is that the government is caving in yet again to the big developers. We have seen from the Minister's second read speech that as a result of the government's housing affordability strategy that was announced, and the Minister then says subsequent discussions with the building industry bodies suggested that additional flexibility would be beneficial. Yes, it seems that the only people that were consulted about these measures are actually those people that will benefit and will get the exemptions. Now, I know that people are raising the question of the fact that these are the people, these are the companies that build the houses. And what we need to be really clear about here is that supply on itself is not the solution to the housing crisis. Supply of affordable housing is the answer, and that is what we need to be seeing, but allowing just more and more property developers to provide more and more supply at what is a larger and larger profit to their bottom line is not the answer to this. We know that this government continues to abdicate its responsibility when it comes to dealing with the housing crisis in this state. If they genuinely wanted to deal with the issues that are facing the communities and the people in New South Wales that are facing housing stress, we would see a number of things, and the Greens are committed to these things. We would see an immediate and urgent reform to the rental laws in this state, which would provide people with the security that they need if they are living in the private rental market. We would see an immediate and significant investment in the amount of public housing and social housing provided to people to reduce that 60,000 strong application waiting list that sees over 100,000 people currently without a home because of the fact that they are not being provided, even though they are eligible for public housing. And we would see an end to the idea of providing property developers with an endless open door to this government to be able to put their profits, their bottom line, ahead of the essential need that should be a basic human right, which is that housing is provided, a safe and secure place for everybody to call home is provided in this state. We are in a housing crisis. There is no denying that that is the case. And instead of being in here debating housing affordability measures, not only are we seeing this government introduce revenue-raising exercises that do not specifically address housing affordability, but now we are seeing those attempts to raise revenue in a way that could potentially be invested in things like affordable and public housing. We are instead seeing this government wind back those measures to be able to provide exemptions and hand over a blank cheque to property developers. This is not the solution, and this is not the answer, and the Greens do not support this bill. I want to end with one final caution to all of those in this place and the campaign teams that may join them in the lead up to the next election. And that is to say that while there is a focus on foreign investment when it comes to this bill, that any attempt by anybody in this place or out in the community to try and whip up racist fear about the concept of foreign investors or foreign owners of properties somehow being to blame for the housing crisis in this state will be called out. I will call them out in here, and I will call them out on the streets, because we need to accept that that is not an acceptable answer, and any government member, any opposition member that attempts to shift the blame onto some foreign investor or some foreign shore for the failures of successive Labor and Liberal governments in this country to deal with the housing affordability crisis will be called out by myself and the Greens.